In the grand halls of the Galactic Academy, where the finest young mind from across the stars gather to prove their worth, there exists one class that separates the promising from the legendary. The Forge of Mastery, where students must craft a blade using nothing but raw materials and their species' ancient techniques. For centuries, this trial has seen magnificent creations, crystalline swords that sing with harmonic frequencies from the Zephyrians, plasma-infused edges that burn through steel from the Pyronic Smiths, and biometallic blades that heal their wielders from the symbiotic Verdani. Each creation tells the story of a civilization's greatest achievements, their technological marvels, their evolutionary advantages. Then came the human girl. While her classmates selected exotic metals, rare crystals, and advanced composites, she walked past them all. Her choice stunned the Academy. A simple piece of bone from Earth's archives. Not even a rare bone, just the femur of an ancient Earth creature called a mammoth. The other students whispered. The instructors frowned. Even the monitoring AI questioned if there had been a mistake. But Sarah Chun knew exactly what she was doing. Because sometimes the most primitive choice reveals the most advanced thinking. Sometimes the greatest weapon isn't forged from the strongest material. It's shaped by the most dangerous mind. And sometimes being human means understanding that survival isn't about having the best tools. It's about making any tool the best. What follows is not just the story of how a human girl turned bone into legend. It's the story of why the galaxy learned to fear what humans call making do. Sarah Chun stood in the massive selection chamber of the Galactic Academy's Material Sciences Division, watching her classmates make their choices with the careful precision of species that had never known true desperation. The chamber stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, its walls lined with samples from 10,000 worlds, each material more exotic and expensive than anything that had ever existed on Earth. Crixtal, the crystalline student from Harmony Prime, ran his six-fingered hands along a wall of resonant gems. Each crystal hummed at a different frequency, and when he found the one that matched his natural harmonic signature, the entire wall seemed to sing. The gems would amplify his people's natural ability to manipulate sound waves, creating a blade that could shatter metal with a whisper or cut through energy shields with a perfectly tuned note. Near the biometals section, Vera of the Verdani Collective was communing with a piece of living steel. The metallic organism pulsed with a gentle green light as it recognized her symbiotic biology. When forged, it would create a blade that could repair itself, adapt to different combat situations, and even provide medical nanobots to heal its wielder during battle. Her people had evolved beyond individual consciousness into a collective biological network, and their tools reflected that unity. Thane Firerot, whose Pyronic ancestors had evolved in the heart of a binary star system, was examining samples of plasma core metals. His internal body temperature of over 300 degrees Celsius would allow him to forge materials that would incinerate anyone else who tried to touch them. His blade would burn through virtually any known material, and could channel his people's natural pyrokinetic abilities into focused energy attacks. Sarah watched them all, noting how each student instinctively moved toward materials that complemented their species' natural advantages. It was logical, efficient, and exactly what the Academy expected. The Forge of Mastery wasn't just about creating a weapon. It was about demonstrating how well each student understood their own people's greatest strengths and could apply them to problem solving. That's what made her choice so shocking. She walked past the exotic metals, past the singing crystals, past the bioorganics and plasma cores. She ignored the zero-point energy matrices that could cut through space-time itself, bypassed the smart materials that could reshape themselves at will, and didn't even glance at the psi-responsive alloys that could be controlled with thought alone. Instead, she stopped at a small, almost forgotten display case in the historical section. Inside was a collection of materials from member worlds' pre-space flight eras. Primitive samples kept more for anthropological interest than practical use. Most students never even noticed this section existed. Sarah's hand pressed against the transparent aluminum as she stared at a simple piece of bone. According to the placard, it was a femur from an extinct Earth creature called a mammoth, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago. It was brown with age, slightly cracked in places, and completely unremarkable by galactic standards. Student Chun came the voice of Professor Aldrich, the Academy's head of advanced materials. His species, the constructors, had evolved from silicon-based life forms and could naturally interface with most technological systems. To him, selecting primitive materials was not just illogical. It was potentially self-destructive. Are you certain about your selection? The bone material you're considering has no enhanced properties. It cannot interface with energy systems. It has no self-repair capabilities, and its molecular structure is, well, it's essentially calcium phosphate with some collagen proteins. Most first-year students could synthesize something superior. Sarah looked up at Professor Aldrich's crystalline features, noting the confusion that rippled across his semi-transparent face in patterns of shifting light. She understood his concern. To most galactic species, the idea of deliberately choosing inferior materials was incomprehensible. Their evolution had been guided by optimization, by making the most of their natural advantages, by building upon strengths that had been refined over millions of years. Humans had evolved differently. I'm certain, Professor, Sarah replied calmly. I request the mammoth femur. A murmur went through the chamber. Krickstall's harmonic humming stopped abruptly, creating an odd silence that felt unnatural after the constant musical backdrop of his crystal selection. Vera's collective consciousness seemed to flicker with surprise, visible as brief interruptions in the bioluminescent patterns that played across her plant-like skin. Even Thane's internal flames dimmed slightly, which for Pyronic was equivalent to a human's jaw dropping. Professor Aldrich's confusion deepened, the light patterns in his face cycling through what Sarah had learned to recognize as the constructor equivalent of deep concern. Student Chun, I must remind you that the Forge of Mastery is not merely an academic exercise. The blade you create will be tested against materials and challenges that would destroy most conventional weapons. Your final grade, your placement in advanced tactical studies, and potentially your entire career trajectory depend on this project. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed with Bone? Sarah nodded, completely certain. What Professor Aldrich didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that humans had a different relationship with limitations than most galactic species. While other races had evolved to maximize their natural advantages, humans had evolved to overcome their natural disadvantages. They weren't the strongest, fastest, smartest, or most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, but they were the most stubborn. More importantly, they were the most creative when backed into a corner. The Material Selection Chamber's AI announced the end of the selection period, and students began moving their chosen materials toward the forging laboratories. Sarah carefully lifted the bone fragment, feeling its weight in her hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, dense with minerals accumulated over millennia. The surface was rough in some places, smooth in others, and she could see the intricate internal structure where ancient marrow had once flowed. As she walked toward her assigned laboratory, Sarah caught fragments of conversation from her classmates. The universal translator made it possible to understand the words, but it couldn't quite convey the tone of disbelief that seemed to unite every species present. Did the human actually choose bone? This from a silicate student whose people were basically living glass. To someone whose body was made of crystalline structures, organic materials probably seemed impossibly primitive. Perhaps it's some kind of Earth superbone we haven't discovered yet. This was one of the aquatic minds, a species that lived in water and had developed incredible pattern recognition abilities. They were probably trying to find some logical explanation for Sarah's choice. Maybe she doesn't understand the assignment? This from a collective intelligence student whose species thought with a shared brain across multiple bodies. Individual decision-making was already strange to them, so an apparently irrational individual decision was doubly confusing. Sarah ignored the whispers and entered her laboratory. The space was designed to accommodate the forging needs of dozens of different species. Atmospheric controls could create any environment. Temperature regulations could handle everything from near absolute zero to stellar core temperatures, and the safety systems could contain explosions that might level a small city. She set the bone on the central workbench and stared at it for a long moment. To everyone watching through the laboratory's observation windows, and she could see dozens of faces pressed against the transparent aluminum. This probably looked like hesitation or confusion. It wasn't. Sarah was thinking about her great-grandfather. Chen Wei had been a blacksmith in rural China before the wars came. When the invaders destroyed his forge and scattered his tools, he hadn't given up. He'd made new tools from scrap metal, built a new forge from broken bricks and salvaged steel, and continued working. When they took his metal, he carved bone. When they took his bone, he shaped stone. When they took his stone, he made weapons from wood and bamboo. A true craftsman, he'd once told her father, doesn't need perfect materials. A true craftsman makes any material perfect. Sarah had heard that story hundreds of times growing up, but she never really understood it until she left Earth. Living among species that had evolved natural advantages, built-in technological interfaces, symbiotic relationships with living materials, internal plasma generation, had shown her what humanity's real strength was. They were the species that made do. She activated the laboratory's analysis system and began studying the bone structure in detail. The molecular scanner revealed a complex matrix of calcium phosphate crystals embedded in a protein framework. It wasn't just primitive material. It was actually a sophisticated composite that had been refined by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. The mammoth whose bone this had lived during one of Earth's ice ages. Every day of its life had been a struggle against an environment that was actively trying to kill it. The cold that would have instantly frozen most galactic species, the scarcity that made every calorie precious, the predators that turned survival into a constant battle. And yet mammoths hadn't just survived, they'd thrived. This bone represented something that Professor Aldrich and her classmates couldn't understand. The engineering that comes from desperation, the innovation born from having no other choice, the strength that develops when every day is a test of whether you deserve to see another dawn. Sarah smiled and began to work. The first step was understanding exactly what she had to work with. The bone's internal structure was fascinating, hollow in places to reduce weight, dense in others to provide strength, with a complex grain pattern that had been shaped by decades of bearing massive loads. The mammoth skeleton had been designed by evolution to support a creature that weighed several tons while remaining mobile enough to migrate across continents. She traced the grain patterns with her finger, feeling how they curved and twisted through the bone structure. This wasn't random. It was a sophisticated engineering solution to the problem of creating maximum strength with minimum weight. Modern human engineers would have needed computer modeling and advanced material science to create something similar artificially. The ancient mammoth had grown it naturally. Sarah activated the laboratory's precision carving tools and began removing unnecessary material. She wasn't trying to force the bone into a predetermined shape. She was discovering the blade that already existed within its structure, following the natural lines of strength, and removing everything that didn't belong. Through the observation window, she could see Professor Aldrich watching with what looked like professional curiosity. The other students had moved on to begin their own work, but she caught glimpses of them glancing in her direction. Krickstall's crystal was already singing as he shaped it with harmonic manipulation, the sound creating beautiful, complex patterns in the laboratory's air. Vera had bonded with her living metal, and it was beginning to flow and reshape itself according to her biological commands. Sarah kept carving. The work was meditative in a way that she hadn't expected. Each cut revealed more of the bone's internal structure, and she found herself developing an intuitive understanding of how it had been formed, how it had functioned, how it had adapted to the stresses of the mammoth's life. She wasn't just creating a tool. She was having a conversation with the past, learning from an engineer who had been dead for 40,000 years. Hours passed. Through the laboratory's windows, she could see other students making remarkable progress. Thane's plasma core metal was beginning to glow with internal fire, and the heat was so intense that the laboratory's safety systems had activated additional shielding. The collective intelligence students' material was shifting through different configurations, apparently testing various possible forms through some kind of shared computational process. Sarah's bone blade was still just bone, but as she worked, something interesting began to happen. The repetitive motion of carving, the focus required to follow the grain patterns, the constant attention to detail, it was putting her into a state that her human ancestors would have recognized. The same focused awareness that had allowed them to track animals across vast distances, to notice the tiny details that meant the difference between finding food and starving, to maintain concentration during tasks that required hours of precise work. She was accessing 40,000 years of human evolution, the same biological programming that had made her ancestors the most persistent hunters on Earth, the same mental state that had allowed them to outlast prey animals that were stronger, faster, and better adapted to their environment. Sarah realized she wasn't getting tired. Her hands weren't cramping, her focus wasn't wavering, and her precision was actually improving as she worked. This was what humans were designed for: the long, careful, patient work of turning raw materials into exactly what they needed to survive. When she finally looked up, most of the other students had finished their rough shaping and moved on to refinement work. Krickstall's crystal blade was nearly complete, its surface flowing with harmonic patterns that would focus and amplify sound waves. Vera's living metal had formed into an elegant curve that pulsed with biological rhythms. Thane's weapon was a barely contained star, radiating heat and light that required the laboratory's full shielding system. Sarah's blade looked like a piece of carved bone, but when she ran her finger along its edge, she smiled. The bone had taught her its secrets, and she had listened. The blade wasn't finished yet. It was barely begun, but already she could feel its potential. Professor Aldrich approached her workstation, his crystalline features cycling through patterns that Sarah had learned indicated academic curiosity mixed with concern. "Student Chun," he said carefully, "I must admit, your approach is unique. However, I feel obligated to remind you that the testing phase will involve materials that could easily destroy conventional bone. Plasma cutting, molecular disintegration fields, crystalline resonance weapons. Are you certain your material choice will prove adequate?" Sarah looked up from her work, and for a moment, Professor Aldrich saw something in her eyes that made his silicon-based consciousness flicker with uncertainty. It wasn't defiance or stubbornness or even confidence. It was patience, the kind of patience that had allowed her ancestors to track wounded prey for days across frozen tundra. The kind of patience that had let them wait in perfect stillness for hours until the perfect moment to strike. The kind of patience that had enabled them to slowly, methodically, persistently hunt much larger and more dangerous animals to extinction. "Professor," Sarah said quietly, "you're thinking about this wrong. You're asking if bone can stand up to plasma and crystals and living metal. But that's not the right question. Then what is?" Sarah smiled, and Professor Aldrich's consciousness flickered again. There was something profoundly unsettling about that smile, something that spoke of evolutionary pressures and survival instinct that a species had never experienced. "The right question," she said, "is whether plasma and crystals and living metal can stand up to what a human can do with bone." She returned to her work, and Professor Aldrich found himself backing away from her workstation without quite understanding why. His analytical mind told him that her confidence was misplaced, that primitive materials could not compete with advanced ones, that evolution had moved beyond such crude approaches to problem solving. But somewhere in the quantum fluctuations of his crystalline consciousness, something much older and more primitive was whispering that perhaps he was wrong. 3 days into the forging period, Sarah's laboratory had become an object of fascination throughout the academy. Students from other programs found excuses to walk past the observation windows. Faculty members stopped by during their breaks, ostensibly to check on student progress, but really to try to understand what the human girl was doing with her primitive bone. What they saw didn't make sense by any conventional standard. While her classmates worked with advanced molecular manipulators, harmonic resonance chambers, and biosynthesis pods, Sarah used tools that belonged in a museum. She had requested access to the Academy's anthropological collection and retrieved implements that her ancestors had used tens of thousands of years ago. Stone knives for precision cutting, bone awls for creating holes, strips of sinew for binding materials together. The laboratory's AI had initially refused her requests, citing safety protocols and material limitations. Primitive tools weren't designed to work in sterile environments with advanced monitoring systems. But Sarah had calmly demonstrated that she could achieve better precision with a properly shaped flint knife than most species could manage with molecular manipulators. The AI had grudgingly complied. Dr. Helix, the Academy's expert on xenobiology, found herself returning to Sarah's laboratory every few hours. As someone who had spent her career studying how different species approach problem solving, she was witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah wasn't just using primitive tools. She was thinking primitively, accessing cognitive patterns that other species had evolved beyond millions of years ago. It's remarkable, Dr. Helix explained to Professor Aldrich during one of their increasingly frequent discussions about the human student. Watch how she moves. See the way she positions her body, how she breathes, how she maintains focus. She's not using modern human cognition. She's somehow accessing the same mental state her ancestors used for survival tasks. Professor Aldrich's crystalline features flickered with patterns of skepticism. Dr. Helix, with respect, accessing primitive cognitive states hardly seems like an advantage in an advanced materials challenge. If anything, it suggests that humans are less evolved than we previously believed. That's where you're wrong, Dr. Helix replied, her tentacled form shifting to indicate strong disagreement. We've been assuming that cognitive evolution always moves toward greater complexity, more sophisticated processing, more advanced abstract thinking. But what if humans develop something different? What if they maintain the ability to shift between cognitive modes depending on the task? Through the observation window, they watched Sarah carefully scrape material from the bone with a stone blade, her movements precise and economical. She had been working for 6 hours straight without a break, and her concentration hadn't wavered once. Look at her efficiency, Dr. Helix continued. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no second-guessing. She's operating on a level of instinctive understanding that most species can only achieve through technological augmentation. She's become the tool. Professor Aldrich wanted to argue, but the evidence was difficult to dismiss. Sarah's work pace hadn't slowed down over the past 3 days. She didn't seem to experience decision fatigue or lose precision over time. If anything, she was working with increasing efficiency as she developed a deeper understanding of her material. More troubling, her bone was beginning to look like something that might actually function as a weapon. The basic shape was emerging, a straight double-edged blade about 30 centimeters long, with a tang that could be fitted with a handle. The profile was elegant in its simplicity. No complex curves or exotic geometries, just clean lines that followed the bone's natural grain patterns. It looked ancient and primitive and somehow inevitable, as if this had always been the blade's intended form. But there were details that didn't fit conventional understanding of bone weapons. The edge wasn't just sharpened. It had been shaped into a complex series of microscopic serrations, each one precisely angled to create maximum cutting efficiency. The surface had been polished to a finish that approached mirror quality, which shouldn't have been possible with stone tools. Most puzzling of all, the bone itself seemed to be changing. Dr. Voss, the Academy's materials specialist, had been taking regular scans of Sarah's work, and the readings were confusing. The bone's density was increasing, its molecular structure was reorganizing, and its crystalline matrix was becoming more ordered. Somehow, Sarah's primitive carving techniques were improving the material at a molecular level. It's impossible, Dr. Voss explained to an increasingly worried Professor Aldrich. Mechanical working can't change fundamental material properties. You can reshape the grain structure, you can eliminate stress points, but you can't actually improve the base material. Yet that's exactly what's happening. Could there be some kind of human biological effect we're not detecting? Professor Aldrich asked. Some kind of symbiotic relationship or chemical excretion that's altering the bone. Eva checked. No chemical changes, no biological agents, no energy emissions beyond normal human body heat. She's just working the material, and it's getting better. They weren't wrong, but they weren't asking the right questions. Sarah understood what was happening because she remembered another story from her great-grandfather about the Japanese swordsmiths who could forge blades that cut through steel by folding ordinary iron thousands of times. They hadn't used magic or advanced technology. They had used patience, understanding, and the knowledge that materials could be convinced to become better than their original nature suggested. The bone was teaching her about itself, and she was teaching it how to be a weapon. Each cut she made removed material that was creating weak points in the crystalline structure. Each scraping motion aligned the protein fibers more efficiently. Each polishing stroke eliminated microscopic flaws that could become failure points under stress. She wasn't just shaping the bone. She was having a conversation with 40,000 years of evolutionary engineering. And the bone was responding. Sarah became aware that she was being watched more closely than the other students, but she didn't let it distract her. She had entered the state that her ancestors called the long hunt, the focused patience that could maintain perfect concentration for days or weeks if necessary. Time became fluid, hunger became irrelevant, and the world outside the task ceased to exist. She was hunting the perfect blade hidden within the imperfect bone. On the fourth day, something changed. Sarah had been working on the fine details of the edge, using a piece of shaped flint to create the final cutting surface. The work required incredible precision. Each stroke had to remove exactly the right amount of material at exactly the right angle to maintain the complex aeration pattern she was creating. Suddenly, the bone sang. It was a soft, low note, barely audible, that seemed to come from the blade itself. Sarah stopped working and listened. The sound was similar to what she'd heard from Krickstahl's crystal weapons, but different somehow. Warmer, more organic, less pure, but more complex. Through the observation window, she saw Professor Aldrich and Dr. Helix staring in shock. Apparently, they could hear it too. Sarah smiled and continued working. The bone had just told her that it was ready for the next phase. She set aside her stone tools and picked up a piece of sinew she had prepared from the Academy's biological materials collection. It was from a creature called an earth elk, chosen specifically for its strength and flexibility. She began wrapping it around what would become the blade's handle, using techniques that hadn't been practiced outside of historical recreation for centuries. But as she worked, she made modifications. The basic binding pattern was ancient, but she adjusted it based on her understanding of modern material science. She created stress distribution points that would transfer impact energy throughout the entire weapon structure. She built in grip patterns that would work for human hands, but also accommodate the different physiologies of her alien classmates. Most importantly, she began incorporating other materials into the binding. From the crystal sample section, she harvested tiny fragments that had been discarded by other students, pieces too small to use for weapons, but perfect for creating focal points in her handle design. From the biometals area, she obtained samples of living material that could interface with the weapon's user. From the plasma core materials, she collected trace elements that could store and channel energy. She wasn't just making a bone weapon anymore. She was creating a hybrid that combined the best aspects of every approach her classmates had taken, unified by the same principles her ancestors had used to survive ice ages and mammoth hunts. The other students began to notice what she was doing, and their reactions ranged from confusion to alarm. "She's contaminating her material," Vera observed, her collective consciousness flickering with patterns of concern. "The purity of the bone will be compromised by introducing foreign elements." Thane's internal flames burned brighter as he watched Sarah work. "It's not contamination," he said slowly. "It's integration. She's making the bone into a foundation for everything else." Krixtal stopped his harmonic manipulation and stared at Sarah's workstation. His crystal weapons were nearly complete, each one a perfect expression of his species' sonic mastery. But Sarah's blade was becoming something else entirely. Not just a weapon designed for humans, but a weapon designed for anyone. "She's not making a bone blade," he said, his harmonic voice carrying strange overtones of respect and worry. "She's making a blade that happens to be built around bone." Professor Aldrich found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about material science. Sarah's approach violated every principle he had been taught about material compatibility and structural integrity. You couldn't just combine random elements from different technological paradigms and expect them to work together. Different materials had different properties, different response patterns, different failure modes. Except Sarah's blade was working. The molecular scans showed a coherent structure where there should have been chaos. The stress analysis revealed that the different materials were actually supporting each other, creating a system that was stronger than any of its individual components. The energy distribution patterns indicated that the weapon would be able to channel not just kinetic force, but also harmonic vibrations, bioelectrical energy, and even plasma discharge. It was impossible. It was also undeniably real. Dr. Helix began developing a theory that made her distinctly uncomfortable. "I think," she told Professor Aldrich during one of their increasingly urgent consultations, "that we're seeing something that predates technological specialization. Before our species developed advanced materials science, before we learned to optimize individual properties, we all had to make do with whatever we could find. We had to make things work together, even when they shouldn't have been compatible." "You're suggesting that primitive material working represents a lost science?" Professor Aldrich's skepticism was becoming harder to maintain as he watched Sarah's impossible weapon take shape. "I'm suggesting that we may have evolved ourselves into a corner. We've become so specialized that we've forgotten how to be generalists. Humans never stopped being generalists. They never lost the ability to make anything work with anything else, because they never had the luxury of perfect materials." Through the window, they watched Sarah begin the final assembly of her weapon. The bone blade slid smoothly into the hybrid handle she had created, locking into place with a soft click that somehow sounded like completion. The different materials seemed to recognize each other, settling into a configuration that looked both ancient and futuristic. Sarah lifted the completed weapon and tested its balance. It moved like it was alive, responding to her slightest motion with fluid grace. When she made a practice cut through the air, the blade sang again, but now the sound was more complex, incorporating harmonic elements from the crystal fragments, biorhythmic pulses from the living metal, and an underlying energy that might have been coming from the plasma core materials. Or it might have been coming from 40,000 years of human stubbornness, refusing to accept that anything was impossible. Sarah smiled and set the weapon on her workbench. Around her, she could feel the weight of dozens of observers trying to understand what they had just witnessed. She could see the confusion and concern on Professor Aldrich's crystalline features, the fascination in Dr. Helix's tentacled movements, the respectful wariness in her classmates' expressions. Tomorrow would be the testing phase, where every weapon would be challenged against materials and forces that could destroy conventional arms. Her classmates had created marvels of advanced engineering, weapons that represented the pinnacle of their respective civilizations' technological achievements. Sarah had created something that shouldn't exist, a primitive weapon that somehow incorporated advanced principles, a bone blade that could channel multiple energy types, a tool that worked not because of its materials but because of the mind that had shaped them. She was looking forward to seeing which approach would prove more effective. As the day period ended and the laboratories dimmed for the night cycle, Sarah remained at her workstation for a few minutes longer. She ran her fingers along the blade's edge, feeling the microscopic serrations that would give it cutting power far beyond what bone should possess. She tested the handle's grip, noting how the various materials had bonded into something that felt like it had been designed specifically for her hand. The weapon was ready. More than ready, it was eager. Tomorrow, the galaxy would learn why humans had once hunted creatures 10 times their size with nothing but sharpened sticks and the absolute certainty that anything that bled could be killed. Tomorrow, they would understand what making do really meant. The testing arena was a marvel of galactic engineering, designed to safely evaluate weapons that could level city blocks or cut through the hulls of starships. Force fields capable of containing stellar explosions surrounded the testing areas, while monitoring equipment sensitive enough to detect quantum fluctuations recorded every detail of each weapon's performance. Sarah stood with her classmates in the observation gallery, watching as the first round of tests began. These preliminary challenges were considered routine, basic cutting tests against standard materials, impact resistance measurements, edge retention analysis. Most Academy weapons passed this phase easily, and it served mainly to establish baseline performance metrics. Crixtal went first. His crystal blade sang as he activated its harmonic resonance, the pure note filling the testing chamber with complex overtones. When the weapon struck the test materials, advanced polymers, crystalline matrices, bioengineered composites, it cut through them like they were made of smoke. The crystal's vibrations disrupted molecular bonds at the quantum level, making material resistance irrelevant. The monitoring equipment registered cutting efficiency at 99.7%, with zero degradation to the blade's edge. It was a perfect example of how advanced materials and species-specific abilities could create weapons that transcended conventional limitations. Vera's living metal blade performed equally well, but in a completely different manner. Instead of forcing its way through materials, it seemed to negotiate with them. The biometallic weapon would touch a test sample and pause for a moment, as if analyzing its structure, then reshape itself to exploit specific weaknesses. Against the polymer, it became thin and flexible. Against the crystal matrix, it grew into a complex cutting array. Against the biocomposite, it actually merged with the material briefly before separating, leaving the sample neatly divided. The audience of faculty and advanced students murmured appreciatively. These were exactly the kinds of innovations the Academy hoped to see. Sophisticated applications of evolutionary advantages resulting in weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Thane's plasma core blade was perhaps the most spectacular. The weapon burned with contained starfire, and when it touched the test materials, they didn't just break. They ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The incredible heat instantly converted solid matter into component atoms, which were then swept away by the blade's magnetic containment field. The monitoring equipment struggled to register the cutting efficiency because there was no resistance to measure. One by one, Sarah's classmates demonstrated weapons that represented the pinnacle of their civilization's technological achievements. Each blade was a masterwork of engineering, perfectly designed to leverage species-specific abilities and advanced materials science. Then it was Sarah's turn. She walked into the testing chamber carrying her bone weapon, and the arena fell silent. After watching displays of harmonic resonance, biotechnological integration, and contained plasma, her blade looked impossibly primitive. It was just carved bone with a wrapped handle, no visible technology, no energy emissions, no signs of the advanced engineering that had characterized every other weapon. Professor Aldrich activated the monitoring systems and announced the first test, standard cutting evaluation against Type A polymer composite. Sarah approached the test material, a block of advanced polymer that was used in starship construction for its combination of strength, flexibility, and impact resistance. The same material that Crixtal's crystal blade had cut through with harmonic disruption, that Vera's living metal had negotiated with through biotechnological interface. Sarah raised her bone blade and made a simple vertical cut. The polymer separated cleanly, the cut so smooth it looked like the material had never been whole. But What made the observers lean forward in confusion was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Krickstahl's crystal had sung as it cut. Vera's living metal had made soft biological sounds as it worked. Thane's plasma had roared with contained energy. Sarah's bone blade cut in complete silence, as if the polymer had simply decided to step aside. The monitoring equipment registered cutting efficiency at 100%. Not 99.7% like the crystal blade, but exactly 100%, meaning that every bit of energy Sarah had put into the cut had been transferred to the material, with no waste, no reflection, no loss to friction or heat or sound. Professor Aldrich checked his instruments twice before announcing the result. Around the observation gallery, faculty members began quiet conversations about measurement errors and calibration issues. Second test, Professor Aldrich announced, his voice carrying an undertone of confusion. Type B crystalline matrix. The crystalline test material was significantly harder than the polymer, designed to evaluate weapons against the kinds of super-hard substances used in advanced armor systems. Sarah approached it with the same calm confidence she had shown with the polymer. This time, instead of simple cut, she made a complex motion, a drawing slice that seemed to flow like water, her blade following curves and angles that looked almost like a dance. The crystalline matrix separated along multiple planes simultaneously, falling apart into geometric shapes that looked like they had been designed by an artist. Again, cutting efficiency, 100%. Again, complete silence. But now, the observers were noticing something else. Sarah wasn't just cutting the materials, she was reading them. Each motion of her blade seemed to follow invisible lines of weakness, finding the exact paths where the molecular bonds were most vulnerable. It was as if she could see the internal structure of everything she touched. Dr. Helix turned to Professor Aldrich with an expression of growing concern. "Those cutting patterns," she said quietly. "She's not forcing her way through the materials. She's finding the natural breaking points and following them." "That's impossible," Professor Aldrich replied, but his protest sounded hollow even to himself. "You can't visually identify molecular weak points. It requires detailed analysis, quantum-level scanning. Unless," Dr. Helix interrupted, "you've evolved to do it instinctively. Unless your species spent millions of years learning to find the weak points in everything they hunted." The third test was Type C biocomposite, a living material that could adapt its properties in real time to resist different types of damage. It was the most challenging of the standard tests, requiring weapons to overcome not just initial resistance, but also active countermeasures. Sarah approached the biocomposite and paused for a moment, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Then she touched her blade to the material's surface, not cutting, just making contact. The biocomposite began to change, shifting its molecular structure to resist the bone weapon. But as it adapted, Sarah adapted too. Her blade began to sing, but not like Krickstahl's crystal. This was a lower, warmer sound, almost like a conversation. The biocomposite paused in its transformations, as if confused. Then Sarah cut, and the material separated without resistance. 100% efficiency, Professor Aldrich announced, but his voice was strained. The biocomposite registered no defensive response. It appears to have cooperated with the cutting action. The preliminary tests concluded with results that made no sense according to conventional understanding. Sarah's primitive bone weapon had not only matched the performance of the most advanced blades in the competition, it had exceeded them. More troubling, it had done so while apparently violating several fundamental laws of material science. But the real testing was just beginning. "Attention, students," announced Dean Korthax, the Academy's highest-ranking official and a member of the ancient eternal race. His species had observed galactic civilization for over 1,000,000 years, and very little surprised them anymore. "The preliminary tests have established baseline capabilities. We will now proceed to the challenge phase, where your weapons will face obstacles designed to test their limits." The testing chamber reconfigured itself, walls sliding aside to reveal a series of increasingly intimidating challenges. There were energy fields that could disrupt molecular bonds, gravity distortion zones that made matter behave in unexpected ways, and temporal shields that could slow or accelerate time locally. Most challenging of all was the final test, a combat simulation against a replica of an ancient war machine from the extinct destroyer civilization. The destroyers had been the galaxy's apex predators before mysteriously vanishing 500,000 years ago, and their technology remained largely incomprehensible. The replica war machine would adapt to whatever weapon faced it, becoming increasingly resistant to each attack until the weapon failed. No student weapon had ever lasted more than a few minutes against the destroyer replica. "Mr. Crixtal," Dean Corthax announced, "please begin." Crixtal entered the challenge arena, his crystal blade singing with harmonic power. The first obstacle was an energy field designed to disrupt organized matter. His weapon approached the field and began to resonate, its frequency shifting until it found a harmonic that matched the energy pattern. The field collapsed, allowing him to pass through. It was an elegant solution that showcased both his weapon's capabilities and his understanding of resonance physics. The Academy observers noted the technique for future study. But at the third obstacle, a gravity distortion that increased local mass by several orders of magnitude, Crixtal's blade began to show strain. The crystal's harmonic resonance became unstable under the extreme gravitational pressure, and small fractures appeared along its surface. By the fifth obstacle, the weapon was too damaged to continue. Vera faced similar challenges. Her living metal blade adapted brilliantly to the first several obstacles, reshaping itself to meet each new challenge. But the temporal shield of the seventh obstacle proved too much for its biological systems. The weapon aged decades and seconds, its living components dying from accelerated time exposure. Thane's plasma blade lasted longer, its incredible energy output allowing it to brute force through obstacles that had stopped the others. But even contained Starfire had limits, and the gravity distortion fields eventually disrupted the magnetic containment. The weapon collapsed into an uncontrolled plasma burst that would have been lethal if not for the arena safety systems. One by one, each advanced weapon succumbed to challenges that exceeded their design parameters. Each failure was educational, providing valuable data about the limits of different technological approaches. Each breakdown was expected, normal, part of the learning process. Then, Sarah entered the arena. She walked calmly through the energy field that had required Crixtal's sophisticated harmonic manipulation. Her bone blade didn't sing or resonate or emit any kind of energy. It simply passed through the field as if it wasn't there. The monitoring systems registered no interaction at all. Professor Aldrich checked his instruments again, certain there must be a malfunction. Dean Corthax, the energy field appears to be non-functional. Student Chun experienced no resistance. Dean Corthax's ancient eyes focused on Sarah with interest. His species had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and he recognized patterns that younger races missed. The field is functioning correctly, Professor Aldrich. Continue observation. Sarah approached the gravity distortion zone that had damaged Crixtal's crystal blade. As the artificial gravity field engaged, increasing her effective mass to several tons, she should have been crushed or at least immobilized. Instead, she adjusted her stance and continued walking. The monitoring equipment showed that she was indeed experiencing the full effect of the gravity distortion. Her mass had increased exactly as expected, but somehow she was moving as if nothing had changed. Her bone blade remained steady in her grip, showing no signs of the stress that had shattered more advanced weapons. Impossible, docteur, vos whispered. The gravitational force should be crushing her bones, rupturing her organs. Unless, Dr. Helix said slowly, her species evolved under variable gravity conditions. Unless humans learned to function in environments where everything was trying to kill them. Dean Corthax nodded approvingly. The human students continue to prove educational. Sarah reached the temporal shield that had aged Vera's living weapon to death. As she entered the field, time began to accelerate around her. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became hours. Her hair should have grown. Her clothes should have aged. Her organic weapon should have decayed. Instead, she seemed to slow down, her movements becoming more deliberate, but also more efficient. She wasn't fighting the time distortion. She was using it, allowing the acceleration to give her more time to think, to analyze, to understand the obstacle she faced. When she emerged from the temporal field, she looked exactly the same as when she had entered. But her bone blade was different somehow. Not aged or damaged, but refined, as if the accelerated time had allowed it to settle into its perfect configuration. By now, the observation gallery was in chaos. Faculty members were arguing over instrument readings, students were staring in disbelief, and even Dean Corthax was leaning forward with interest. Sarah had reached the final challenge, the Destroyer War Machine replica. The ancient device activated as she approached, its sensors scanning her weapon and beginning the adaptation process that had defeated every Academy weapon for decades. Its defenses configured themselves to resist bone-based attacks, reinforcing against the kind of primitive kinetic damage that Stone Age weapons might inflict. Sarah raised her blade and struck. The war machine's armor parted like water. The ancient device paused, its sensors reconfiguring frantically. This wasn't possible. The human weapon showed no energy emissions, no advanced technology, nothing that should have been capable of penetrating destroyer-grade armor. It began adapting again, this time reinforcing against harmonic attacks like Krikstal's crystal blade. Sarah struck again, and again the armor offered no resistance. The war machine's adaptation protocols began cycling faster, trying configuration after configuration. It reinforced against plasma attacks, biotechnological penetration, quantum field manipulation, temporal distortion, every advanced attack mode in its vast database. Sarah kept cutting, and the machine kept falling apart. Finally, the war machine tried something unprecedented in its millions of years of operation. It attempted to adapt to an attack it couldn't understand, couldn't categorize, couldn't define. Its ancient processors began analyzing Sarah herself, trying to understand what kind of threat she represented. And for the first time in 500,000 years, a destroyer war machine experienced something its creators had never programmed it to handle: uncertainty. The machine's sensors focused on Sarah, scanning her biology, her weapon, her movements. What they found was a creature that shouldn't have been dangerous. No natural weapons, no advanced technology, no apparent evolutionary advantages. Just a moderately intelligent bipedal mammal with a carved piece of bone. But the bone wouldn't stop cutting through the machine's armor, and the mammal showed no signs of fatigue or fear or doubt. The war machine's final scan detected something that made its ancient circuits flicker with what might have been recognition. Hidden in the human's genetic structure, written into her very DNA, was a history of impossible victories. Creatures 10 times her size, environments that should have killed her species, challenges that should have ended her evolutionary line before it began. All overcome through the simple strategy of refusing to stop. The destroyer war machine, apex technology of a species that had conquered galaxies, experienced its first moment of existential doubt. If this primitive creature could defeat its armor, its weapons, its defenses, then what else might it be capable of? What else might her species be capable of? The machine shut down, not because it was destroyed, but because its logic circuits could not process the contradictions Sarah represented. In its vast database of threats and countermeasures, there was no entry for stubborn mammal with pointed stick. There was no protocol for dealing with something that refused to recognize when it was supposed to lose. Sarah lowered her bone blade and looked around the silent arena. Through the observation windows, she could see dozens of faces staring at her in shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. She had just done something that advanced weapons, sophisticated engineering, and millions of years of technological development had failed to accomplish. She had defeated a destroyer war machine with a piece of carved bone. More importantly, she had done it by being utterly, completely, stubbornly human. Dean Corthax was the first to speak, his ancient voice carrying undertones of respect and concern. "Student Chun, your weapon has performed adequately." Sarah smiled, recognizing the massive understatement for what it was. "Thank you, Dean Corthax." "Tell me," the dean continued, "what exactly did you do?" Sarah looked down at her bone blade, then back at the observation gallery filled with the galaxy's finest minds struggling to understand what they had witnessed. "I made do," she said simply. The Academy's emergency faculty meeting convened within hours of Sarah's impossible demonstration. The central conference chamber, designed to accommodate representatives from hundreds of different species, buzzed with agitated conversations in dozens of languages. The universal translators worked overtime to keep up with the rapid-fire discussions, debates, and arguments that filled the air. At the center of it all sat Sarah's bone blade, now secured in a stasis field while teams of scientists tried to understand how a primitive weapon had accomplished something that violated their fundamental understanding of physics, materials science, and military engineering. Dean Corthax called for order with a harmonic chime that resonated through the chamber's crystalline walls. His ancient eyes surveyed the assembled faculty, noting the expressions of confusion, concern, and barely contained panic on faces evolved from a dozen different evolutionary paths. "Fellow educators," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000,000 years of accumulated wisdom. "We are faced with a situation that challenges our basic assumptions about technological advancement, material science, and the nature of effective problem-solving. Student Chin's performance in the weapons evaluation has raised questions that extend far beyond academic assessment." Professor Aldrich's crystalline features flickered with patterns of distress. "Dean Corthax, with respect, I believe we must consider the possibility of measurement error or equipment malfunction. The performance characteristics we observed are simply impossible according to established physical laws." Dr. Voss nodded agreement, her metallic form reflecting the chamber's lights in agitated patterns. "The cutting efficiency readings, the energy transfer measurements, the lack of material degradation, none of it makes sense. Advanced materials don't just fail against primitive ones. Evolution doesn't move backwards. Unless," Dr. Helix interjected, her tentacled form shifting to indicate strong disagreement, "we've been making incorrect assumptions about the nature of evolutionary advancement. What if technological progress isn't always linear? What if sophistication sometimes sacrifices effectiveness?" A new voice joined the discussion. Dr. Nexus, the Academy's expert on ancient technologies. His species, the Archaeans, had dedicated themselves to studying the remnants of extinct civilizations. "I've been analyzing the performance data from Student Chin's demonstration, cross-referencing it against our databases of pre-technological warfare techniques from across the galaxy." The chamber fell silent as Dr. Nexus activated a holographic display showing combat techniques from hundreds of different species during their pre-spaceflight periods. There's a consistent pattern among successful pre-technological warriors. They don't try to overpower their enemies with superior materials or energy. They find ways to make their enemies defeat themselves. Dean Corthax leaned forward with interest. "Explain." "Student Chin wasn't cutting through the test materials, Dr. Nexus continued, his analysis causing uncomfortable shifts throughout the assembled faculty. "She was convincing them to separate. Her blade found the molecular weak points, the stress fractures, the natural failure lines, and simply suggested that they give way." Professor Aldrich's skepticism flared. "Materials don't have consciousness, Dr. Nexus. They can't be convinced to do anything." "Can't they?" Dr. Nexus replied, his display shifting to show molecular-level analysis of Sarah's cutting actions. "Watch the interaction patterns. See how her blade's vibrations, barely detectable, completely organic, match the natural resonance frequencies of the material she cut. She wasn't overpowering molecular bonds. She was singing them apart." The implications hit the chamber like a quantum shockwave. If Dr. Nexus was correct, Sarah hadn't used advanced technology to defeat advanced technology. She had used something far more sophisticated, an intuitive understanding of how matter wanted to behave, combined with the patience and precision to work with those natural tendencies instead of against them. Dr. Helix's voice carried undertones of growing excitement and alarm. If humans retained the ability to read material structures at an intuitive level, if they never lost the cognitive patterns that allowed them to find weak points in everything they hunted, then they represent a form of technological regression, Professor Aldrich interrupted. A step backwards in evolutionary development. No, Dean Corthax said quietly, and the authority in his ancient voice brought immediate silence to the chamber. They represent something we thought was extinct, generalist adaptation. Every other spacefaring species specialized as they advanced. We optimized our strengths and minimized our weaknesses. Humans appear to have done the opposite. The Dean's analysis was supported by data that had been accumulating since humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. Human students consistently performed below expectations in specialized technical fields, but above expectations in interdisciplinary challenges. Human engineers created solutions that were less elegant than specialist approaches, but worked in a wider variety of conditions. Human diplomats were less sophisticated than species that had evolved for social interaction, but more effective at bridging communication gaps between radically different cultures. Humanity's apparent weakness, their lack of specialization, was actually a strategic advantage that no other galactic species possessed. We need to understand the implications, Dean Corthax continued. If human generalist adaptation can defeat destroyer technology, what else might it be capable of? What other assumptions about technological advancement might be incorrect? Dr. Quantum, the Academy's expert on theoretical physics, raised a concern that made several faculty members uncomfortable. Dean Corthax, there's a more troubling possibility we must consider. What if student Chen's success wasn't just about generalist adaptation? What if humans somehow maintained access to pre-technological survival skills that we've all forgotten? The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Galactic civilization was built on the assumption that technological advancement was always superior to primitive approaches. Societies that failed to embrace technological solutions were considered backwards, underdeveloped, destined for extinction. But if primitive approaches could sometimes outperform advanced ones, we need to test this hypothesis, Dean Corthax announced. Dr. Helix, I want you to design a series of challenges that will evaluate human problem-solving approaches against conventional galactic solutions. Professor Aldrich, work with Dr. Voss to analyze student Chen's weapon using every scanning method available. Dr. Nexus, examine our historical databases for similar examples of primitive techniques defeating advanced ones. As the faculty dispersed to their assigned tasks, none of them noticed that Sarah had been listening to their entire discussion from the observation gallery above the conference chamber. Human hearing wasn't particularly acute by galactic standards, but the Academy's architect had never considered the possibility that someone might want to eavesdrop on faculty meetings. Sarah understood exactly what they were worried about, and she knew they were asking the wrong questions. They were trying to understand how her bone blade had defeated advanced technology. But the real question was why humans had never abandoned primitive techniques in the first place. The answer was simple: because they worked. While other species had optimized themselves for specific environments and challenges, humans had remained generalists by necessity. Earth was a world that tried to kill its inhabitants through variety. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, climate changes, asteroid impacts, plague, predators, and 1,000 other threats that required different survival strategies. Humans had survived by becoming adaptable, not specialized. They had learned to make tools from whatever was available, to find food in any environment, to solve problems without perfect resources. Most importantly, they had learned to never give up because giving up on Earth usually meant death. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept limitations, that willingness to make any tool work. Those weren't primitive traits that should be abandoned for more advanced approaches. They were survival skills that had been refined by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. And now they were about to be tested against the greatest challenges the galaxy could provide. Sarah made her way back to her dormitory, where she found messages waiting from several faculty members requesting interviews, from news organizations wanting to discuss her remarkable achievement, and from military organizations offering positions in their advanced weapons programs. She ignored them all and instead sent a single message to her family back on Earth. Made something useful in school today. Looking forward to making more. Her great-grandfather would have understood. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the academy, teams of scientists were discovering that Sarah's bone blade was even more impossible than they had initially realized. The weapon appeared to be a single piece of shaped bone, but detailed analysis revealed molecular structures that shouldn't exist. The calcium phosphate matrix had been reorganized at the atomic level, creating crystalline patterns that provided strength comparable to advanced metallic alloys. The protein fibers hadn't just been preserved, they had been enhanced, forming flexible networks that could distribute stress loads across the entire weapon structure. Most puzzling of all, the bone seemed to be learning from each test, subtly adjusting its molecular configuration to perform better in subsequent evaluations. It was as if the weapon was alive, adapting, and improving through use. Dr. Voss's report to Dean Korthax was filled with technical language, but the conclusion was simple. We don't understand how this weapon exists, how it functions, or how it was created. Every analysis reveals new impossibilities. If we didn't have detailed recordings of student Chen's construction process, I would conclude that the weapon was produced by technology beyond our current understanding. Dean Korthax reviewed the reports from across the Academy's departments, each one confirming that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization. Not just another species with useful abilities, but a species that approached problem-solving from directions that other races hadn't considered possible. More concerning, humans seemed to be completely unaware of how remarkable their capabilities were. Sarah Chun thought she had simply made a useful tool using traditional techniques. She showed no signs of understanding that she had violated several fundamental laws of physics and material science, which raised the most troubling question of all. If this was what humans considered normal problem-solving, what might they be capable of when they really tried? The Academy's databases contained detailed analyses of every member species' capabilities, potential contributions to galactic civilization, and possible threats to established order. Humans have been categorized as moderate potential, low specialization, suitable for general labor and diplomatic support roles. Dean Korthax authorized a complete revision of that assessment. But he also authorized something else, a discreet communication to the Galactic Security Council, informing them that humanity might represent a strategic consideration that required careful monitoring. Not because humans were dangerous in the conventional sense. They showed no signs of aggressive expansion, territorial ambitions, or technological imperialism. Their military forces were adequate but not threatening. Their political systems were chaotic but stable. Their cultural values emphasized cooperation and mutual aid. They were potentially dangerous because they were unpredictable, because they could look at any problem and find solutions that no one else would consider, because they had survived their home world by becoming the species that never accepted that anything was impossible. And now they were spreading across the galaxy, bringing that stubborn problem-solving ability to challenges that had remained unsolved for millions of years. Sarah lay in her dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the next day's classes. She had homework to finish for advanced xenobiology, a project due in comparative cultural studies, and a meeting with her academic advisor to discuss career options. It was going to be a busy week. She had no idea that her bone blade had just triggered the largest reassessment of galactic strategic doctrine in recorded history. She didn't know that every human colony was now under discreet surveillance, or that research teams were being dispatched to Earth to study human problem-solving techniques. She just knew that she had made something useful, and tomorrow she would probably need to make something else. That was what humans did. They made things work, whether the galaxy was ready for that or not. 6 months after the Bone Blade incident, the Galactic Academy had quietly become the center of the most comprehensive study of human capabilities ever undertaken. Research teams from every major civilization had requested access to human students, and Sarah Chun had unknowingly become the most observed individual in the galaxy. She remained completely oblivious to this attention, focused instead on her advanced coursework in interspecies engineering, a program that had been hastily created when it became clear that human students approached technical problems in ways that complemented rather than competed with existing galactic expertise. The program's first major project was designed to be impossible. Professor Aldrich, still struggling to understand how Sarah's primitive weapon had violated his understanding of material science, had collaborated with experts from across the galaxy to create a challenge that would test the limits of human problem-solving abilities. The task was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. Repair a damaged void engine using only materials and tools available on a primitive world. Void engines were the pinnacle of galactic technology, massive devices that could fold space-time to enable faster-than-light travel. They incorporated quantum field manipulators, exotic matter containment systems, temporal stabilizers, and consciousness interface networks that allowed direct mental control by specially trained operators. When a void engine failed, it required teams of specialists, advanced fabrication facilities, and materials that could only be synthesized in zero-gravity quantum laboratories. The damaged engine they provided for the project had been destroyed in a catastrophic failure that had warped its internal structure across 17 different dimensions. Conventional repair would require completely rebuilding the device from scratch using materials that didn't exist on any inhabited world. Sarah looked at the twisted wreckage and smiled. Her project partner was Zixandra, a member of the synthetic collective whose species had evolved beyond biological limitations by merging their consciousness with advanced computational systems. Zixandra could process millions of calculations simultaneously, access any technical database in the galaxy instantaneously, and interface directly with technological systems through quantum consciousness bridges. She was exactly the kind of specialized intelligence that made galactic civilization possible. Sarah was a human who liked to fix things with whatever happened to be lying around. The damage assessment is complete, Zixandra announced, her voice carrying the harmonic overtones that indicated direct data stream communication. The engine's quantum matrix has been destabilized across multiple dimensional phases. The exotic matter containment system has suffered cascade failures in 17 separate chambers. The temporal stabilization network has been reversed in orientation, creating localized time distortions that prevent conventional repair techniques. Sarah nodded, running her hands over the engine's damaged surface. The metal felt wrong somehow, not just broken, but confused, as if the machine couldn't remember what it was supposed to be. The conventional repair approach, Zixandra continued, would require approximately 14,000 hours of work by specialized technicians, utilizing materials with a combined value equivalent to the annual economic output of a medium-sized solar system. Given our constraints, successful repair is mathematically impossible. Okay, Sarah said cheerfully, so we can't fix it the normal way. Let's try something else. Zixandra's processing systems flickered with what might have been confusion. Sarah, I don't think you understand. This isn't a matter of finding alternative approaches. The mathematical models are clear. They require materials, and techniques simply don't exist within our parameters. Sarah was examining the engine's damaged quantum matrix with the kind of focused attention that her professors had learned to recognize as dangerous. Zix, can you show me how this thing is supposed to work once functional? Of course. Zixandra activated a holographic display showing the engine's normal operational state. The complex three-dimensional diagram showed energy flows, quantum field interactions, and space-time manipulation patterns that represented centuries of advanced physics research. Sarah stared at the display for several minutes, her expression growing more thoughtful. So basically, this thing works by convincing spacetime that two distant points are actually the same point. That's a gross oversimplification, but essentially correct. And when it broke, all these systems got confused about what they're supposed to do. The damage created cascade failures that disrupted the operational matrices. Yes. Sarah nodded and turned back to the broken engine. Zix, I think you're approaching this wrong. You're trying to fix the machine. But what if we fix the problem instead? I don't understand the distinction. Sarah began pulling tools from her kit. Not the advanced fabrication devices that filled most of the laboratory, but simple instruments that looked like they belonged in a pre-industrial workshop. Hammers, chisels, files, and measuring devices that worked through mechanical rather than quantum principles. The problem, Sarah explained as she began working, isn't that the machine is broken. The problem is that it's confused. All these systems are trying to do their jobs, but they can't remember how they're supposed to work together. They need someone to remind them. Zixandra's consciousness flickered with uncertainty. Sarah, those are molecular manipulators and quantum field generators. They don't have memory or consciousness. They can't be reminded of anything. Sure they can, Sarah replied, using a simple steel file to smooth out microscopic irregularities in the engine's quantum matrix housing. Everything remembers what it's supposed to be. Sometimes it just needs a little help. What Sarah was doing shouldn't have been possible. She was using mechanical tools to adjust components that operated on quantum principles. The file she was using was made of simple iron and carbon, materials that shouldn't have been able to affect exotic matter containment systems. But as she worked, the twisted metal began to straighten. The quantum matrix housing, which had been warped across multiple dimensions, slowly resumed its proper configuration. The exotic matter chambers, which had suffered cascade failures, began to stabilize as Sarah's precise adjustments removed microscopic stress points that were preventing proper function. Zixandra watched in growing astonishment as Sarah essentially convinced a device that represented the pinnacle of galactic technology to repair itself using tools that belonged in a museum. "This is impossible," Zixandra muttered, her processing systems struggling to analyze what she was observing. "You're using primitive mechanical manipulation to affect quantum-level systems. The scale differential alone should make this impossible." Sarah paused in her work and looked up with genuine confusion. Why should scale matter? Everything's connected to everything else. If you change something small, it affects something big. If you fix the foundation, the rest of the building straightens itself out. It was such a fundamentally human perspective that Zixandra's advanced consciousness had trouble processing it. Galactic civilization was built on specialization, on understanding complex systems by breaking them down into manageable components. Each component was analyzed and optimized independently, then integrated with other optimized components to create sophisticated wholes. Sarah was doing the opposite. She was treating the entire engine as a single, interconnected system and fixing the whole thing by addressing the relationships between its parts. More troubling, it was working. Over the following days, as Sarah continued her impossible repair work, word spread throughout the academy that something unprecedented was happening. Faculty members found excuses to visit the interspecies engineering laboratory. Students gathered in observation areas to watch the human work, and even Dean Corthax began making regular appearances. What they saw challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of technology, repair techniques, and the relationship between operator and machine. Sarah didn't just fix the void engine. She seemed to communicate with it. Her tools, primitive though they were, found problems that advanced diagnostic systems had missed. Her adjustments, mechanical though they appeared, solved quantum-level malfunctions that should have required specialized equipment. Most remarkably, the engine began to perform better than its original specifications. "The efficiency improvements are unexplainable," reported Dr. Voss during one of the increasingly frequent faculty briefings about Sarah's progress. "The engine is now processing quantum field manipulations with 23% greater efficiency than when it was first manufactured. The exotic matter containment systems are more stable the temporal stabilization network is more responsive, and the consciousness interface is, well, it's actually enjoyable to use. Professor Aldrich, who had been documenting every aspect of Sarah's repair techniques, was forced to confront the possibility that his understanding of advanced technology was fundamentally incomplete. "She's not just fixing the machine," he reported to Dean Korthax. "She's teaching it how to be better than it was designed to be." Dean Korthax reviewed the reports with the patience of someone who had observed galactic civilization for over 1,000,000 years. The data was clear. Sarah's primitive repair techniques were producing results that advanced technological approaches couldn't match. More concerning, she was teaching these techniques to other students. Zixandra, whose species represented the pinnacle of technological integration, had begun requesting simple mechanical tools for her own projects. Other students in the program were experimenting with what they called intuitive engineering, approaching complex systems as interconnected wholes rather than collections of optimized components. The results were unprecedented. Ancient systems that had been considered beyond repair were being restored to full function. Devices that had never worked properly were being improved by students who barely understood their theoretical principles. Most troubling of all, several major engineering problems that had remained unsolved for centuries were being approached with entirely new methodologies. Humanity wasn't just contributing to galactic civilization. They were changing how galactic civilization thought about technology itself. The implications were staggering. If human approaches to problem-solving could improve void engines, what else might they be capable of? How many other technological assumptions might be incorrect? What other impossible challenges might become solvable with the right perspective? Dean Korthax found himself facing a decision that would affect the future of galactic civilization. The traditional approach would be to study human techniques, categorize them, and integrate them into existing technological frameworks. It was safe, predictable, and would maintain the stability that had characterized galactic society for millions of years. The alternative was to allow humans to continue developing their approaches independently, to see where their unique perspective might lead. It was risky, unpredictable, and could potentially disrupt the careful balance that had prevented major conflicts for eons. As he watched Sarah put the finishing touches on her impossible repair job, Dean Korthax made his decision. He authorized the expansion of the Human Studies program, opened new research partnerships with Earth's educational institutions, and quietly suggested to the Galactic Council that humanity might represent an opportunity rather than a concern. But he also activated protocols that would monitor human technological development more closely than any species in galactic history. Because while Sarah Chun might have just fixed a broken engine, she had also demonstrated that humans were capable of things that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations considered impossible. And if they could do this with a void engine, what might they do when they really set their minds to something? Sarah stepped back from the completed repair job and wiped her hands on a rag that was older than most galactic civilizations. The void engine hummed with a contentment that sounded almost organic, its quantum matrices singing in harmonies that hadn't existed in its original design. "All done," she announced to Zixandra, whose consciousness was still processing the impossibilities she had witnessed. "Want to test it?" Zixandra interfaced with the engine's consciousness network and immediately understood why Dr. Voss had described it as enjoyable. The machine didn't just respond to commands. It anticipated them, offering suggestions and optimizations that made operation feel like a conversation between old friends. "Sarah," Zixandra said slowly, "this engine is better than anything in the galactic fleet." "How'd you do this?" Sarah shrugged, already packing away her primitive tools. "It just wanted to work properly. I helped it remember how." She had no idea that she had just triggered the largest technological revolution in galactic history. She didn't know that her repair techniques would be studied for centuries, or that intuitive engineering will become a new field of study offered at academies throughout the galaxy. She just knew that she had fixed something that was broken, and now it worked better than it had before. That was what humans did, and the galaxy was finally beginning to understand what that meant. As Sarah left the laboratory, Dean Korthax remained behind, studying the impossible engine and contemplating the future. In his million years of existence, he had seen the rise and fall of countless civil